Okay. Perfect. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Olivia Amaya Ortiz, and I'm an educator here at the Indian Arts Research Center, which is a division of the School for Advanced Research. I'm speaking from our campus in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I'd like to acknowledge that we as an institution are situated on traditional Tewa lands. I'm a humbled guest to this land and grateful for the continued stewardship by the many Pueblo, Apache, and Dene peoples who call this greater region home. Tonight, we're gathered to celebrate 2023 Eric and Barbara Dobkin Native Artist Fellow Janna Avner. I'm excited to join you as we learn more about Koyoko and Athabascan artist Janna's time spent in residence. Janna is the first practicing light artist to join our SAR Artist Fellowship community, and you might be asking yourself, what the heck is a light artist? At times, I also struggled with the correct verbiage to capture the true multidisciplinary, beautifully complex, and cerebral nature of Janna's work. Using digital light as her primary medium, Janna's work reclaims romanticizations of landscape imagery and incorporates expansive interpretations of indigeneity, perception, and the environment. Her pieces serve as visual metaphors that at times contain projections of beadwork and hologram recreations of the Northern Lights, both an homage to her native Alaska and a visual metaphor of the continuity of such traditional art forms. Before we begin, I want to note that we're streaming this event live via our YouTube channel. So for those who are with us in person, following our QA section, we will embark on a tour of the Dubin Studio where Janna has been working while in residence. Please make sure to join us afterwards. Light refreshments will be provided. When first applying for a fellowship, Janna proposed to make prototypes, studies, and one potential design of a final art piece in the form of paintings and glass, drawings, holograms, and software renderings. This evening, we will get to see that design in the Dubin Studio. Finally, I would like to thank the Dobkin family for their generosity in supporting this fellowship. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Janna Avner.
Oh, it's close to the other mic.
That'll do it. Just get that out of the way. Okay. Everybody can hear me okay? I don't talk very loudly, so the mic helps. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I really appreciate just everybody here, and I just look forward to you all coming to my studio after. To take a look at these things in person, right? Because it's nice when they're on a flat screen, that's one thing. But it's nice just to see them, see what they're like in person. So I'll start with...
Turn off that other one?
Yeah.
It's off. It's not on.
Okay.
Oh, I'm hearing other things. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Hello? Are we good? It's not on. Okay. So my paintings, sculptures, and videos emphasize cognition and perception through the generation of physical and digital experiences. Yeah, as you can tell, I don't have a ton of public speaking experience, but when viewed from oblique angles, my work reveals the interactions of projected light resulting in a recreation of the aurora borealis, which you can sort of see right here. I produce physical and digital works where liminality in between spaces and experiences outside a colonized world offer new possibilities. As a multi-heritage Alaskan native, Koyukon Athabascan, I document natural light in the Alaskan and Californian terrain to reimagine perception as indigenous, subliminal, and theoretical. The work insists that perception is as much a simple act as it is a subjective creation. False light permeates my pieces and may appear artificial and at other times genuine. Light itself is not objective. It bends and twists, invoking the unsolvable particle-wave paradox in quantum mechanics. This shifting and unresolved framework guides my physical and experiential image making. Using light as a material, I reclaim the romanticization of landscape imagery that often drives tourism, commerce, and profit in spaces of natural beauty, such as Alaska or Santa Fe, which in some situations might arguably hearken to early Manifest Destiny policies in the American West. But I'm sort of interested in going a bit beyond that, reclaiming this imagery and providing expansive interpretations of indigeneity, perception, and the environment. As a visual metaphor, projections of beadwork and indigenous imagery become the light that moves through everything, embodying continuity in relation to past and present technologies. Digital, traditional, and upcycled materials form hybrid objects that represent an imagined and ancestral potentiality. If we are active participants in the optical viewing of phenomena, my work speculatively asks, what is seen when imagining the future? This presentation today is adapted from my master's, which I received from California State University, Northridge. My thesis was, and my work here at the Indian Arts Research Center is dedicated to my grandmother, Mary Jane Fate, who passed away in 2020. Fate was an Alaska Native Athabascan elder and statewide leader for Alaska's advancement. Just some of her accomplishments were successfully lobbying Congress and government to convey 45.5 million acres and $1 billion to Alaska Natives through the passage of the Alaska Native Land Claims Settlement Act in 1971. Fate was the president of her village corporation, a member of the University of Alaska Board of Regents, a recipient of the Presidential Award for her work to bring mammograms to rural Alaska, and was one of the first Alaska Native women to attend the University of Alaska. On a personal note, my grandmother was a wonderful person and wonderful teacher of fishing and camping in the Alaskan wilderness. While in New Mexico, I would like to acknowledge the following people who made my time here possible. I would like to thank both Sharada Hall and Sue Pisano for their healing therapeutic techniques in Eastern medicine. I don't think I could have gotten through those long studio hours without you both. I would also like to thank Olivia Amaya Ortiz and Molly Winslow at the Indian Arts Research Center for helping me get settled and providing me with great support. I also would like to thank my friends and family back home, as well as my husband who is here today, for encouraging me to continue making this work, and for joyful conversations with Kat Bernhardt, Allison Greenberg, Shelley Martin, and Lynn Bain. You all made me feel like Santa Fe is, in a way, a second or third home, so I appreciate that. Also, a shout out to my mom, Janna Avner, who helped me think through this thesis last spring. My work here begins with how I define indigeneity, as I am a tribal member who is also multicultural. I was born in Los Angeles and travel often to Alaska to fish the Yukon River 60 miles south of the Arctic Circle in the wilderness, and to perform other meaningful cultural activities. In conventional terms, indigeneity is defined in relation to ancestral lands, so it is primarily framed in geographic terms. Indigeneity is defined in relation to people's daily activities in a specific, typically rural biome, which in my case results in, I would argue, unresolved categorizations for urban natives like myself who do not live on, but might perform circular, almost migratory type visits to an ancestral land. According to a 2018 census statistics from the Alaska Department of Labor and Workforce Development, 52% of Alaska Natives now live in cities. Outlined in the comprehensive anthropology research book titled Indigenous in the City, Contemporary Identities and Cultural Innovation, the creation of indigenous homelands outside of cities is itself a colonial invention. Not only are conventional definitions of natives based on their connection to rural ancestral lands, which is belied by urban dwelling natives, but even distinctions made between cities, villages, and rural towns are modern inventions primarily conceived without indigenous consent. The text Indigenous in the City speaks to the complexity of geography-based definitions of indigeneity that the authors argue lead to internalized dichotomies for urban natives, which must be repudiated and reworked. So we might reinterpret the notion of land itself, not simply as a geographic turf, but as memories of activities that evoke the land, even though these activities may not always be performed on that specific geographic turf. Through physical and digital artworks, I describe my own multicultural relationship to land not only as physical activities distinctly performed in the subarctic biome, where we have our fish camp, but that these activities can also be understood as a psychological experience, something that I remember while I'm away from Alaska. I have found support for the symbolic and multi-heritage concepts of land through a term called land base, coined by artist George Longfish, who is Seneca Tuscarora, and writer Joan Randall in a 1983 transcript. My understanding of my own multi-heritage perspective is a felt experience of land. The novel by Tommy Orange titled There, There, as well as anthropological research of indigenous in the city, support broader interpretations of modern and multicultural indigeneity today. Furthermore, I hope this presentation on digital media techniques to imagine a sense of place in relation to indigeneity and indigenous futures movements provides an example of how a personal understanding of native thrives by negotiating today's technology-based locales. So for my work here at the Indian Arts Research Center, I created a sculpture, an installation, paintings, and a software rendering that all evoke atmospheric light from a location, not physically located within an ancestral land, but comprise various materials belonging to a native context, such as beadwork, moosehide, birchwood, sage, bioplastics made of plants, wolverine vertebrae, muskrat fur, and yet this piece also deliberately goes outside that context. So you can see these are some process shots of me making the piece, and the whole piece will be properly seen in my studio. Yet this piece also deliberately goes outside that context by incorporating materials such as metal, glass, and construction foam. I mix these materials from different contexts to speak to the non-ubiquity and heterogeneity of my own experience of being native, while also looking to celebrate an imagination of land that makes up multicultural native identity. Additionally, my artwork viewed here, titled Athabascan Ghost Wave Flower Test, is documentation of my thesis, and I will do a small demonstration for you of this type of installation work in my studio. For this artwork, I recreated the northern lights through a piece of crumpled dichroic film lit by a projected image of my Athabascan tribe's floral beadwork motif, which is then distorted through mirrors to illuminate a painting and itself in a repetitive light loop. I recreated the northern lights with what I could find around the house to communicate my personal feelings of dislocation while being away from Alaska. This work is also a speculative nudge. The art projection incorporates the earliest 19th century technique for recreating holograms called Pepper's ghost effect. Thus, this piece also hints at augmented reality, or at least its earliest stages, as it incorporates a transparent digital overlay. In the studio here at Indian Arts Research Center, I got to go beyond these materials and additionally experiment with a fog machine and smudge smoke. I'm grateful to Indian Arts Research Center and School for Advanced Research for giving me this chance to take my work many steps further. I decided to embark on my most recent body of work not because I am overjoyed to enter the difficult territory of making art about one's identity, but because my grandmother passed away in 2020. Her and my grandfather's absence have been difficult for me. My grandparents knew how to live with the land, how to fish in the wilderness, and so we now do this all without them and miss them very much. Before my grandfather passed away, he asked my family to record his memories. He discussed old Alaskan stories from hunting with natives the old way. He discussed his statewide policy advocacy for schools and villages so native children could remain closer to their homes. That's outside the boarding school sort of policies that took place for many years. And how he befriended an oil painter named Rusty Herline, who then became my mother's godparent. My grieving process for their passing in the middle of a pandemic, during which grief is part of everyday life, prompted me to create digital beadwork imagery that shifts into a light sculpture of the aurora borealis as an attempt to cope with loss and feel closer to Alaska while in California getting my master's. With this context, and against the backdrop of grief, I attempt to create a visual poetics with indigeneity at the intersection of old and emerging technologies as a metaphor for sustaining an imagined indigenous future. As a visual metaphor, the beadwork becomes the light that moves through everything, an embodied continuity of past and present technologies. This work is both digital and physical, garnering the term phygital, a descriptor initially used in the Wall Street Journal to describe like NFTs and other digital works that also have a physical component. In support of broader, more poetic definitions of indigeneity, which can provide more nuance to simplistic geography-based definitions, writer and art critic Lucy Lippard writes in 1990 in her book, Mixed Blessings, New Art in a Multicultural America, that multicultural experience is, in quote, a liminal experience. Quoting theorist Kumkum Sangari, Lippard describes multicultural perspective as, quote, poised in a liminal space and an in-between time, which, having broken out of the binary opposition between circular and linear, gives a third space and a different time the chance to emerge, end quote. So what is this third space Sangari and Lippard speak of? Though I don't think they meant for us to take this phrase literally, it seems that Sangari describes multicultural experience as if it were a location, a space real enough to inhabit. Yet this third space requires the person from a multicultural viewpoint to exist in the first place and perform those activities from varying cultures. The answer for defining urban indigeneity that defines me, in a way, I guess, a component of which is necessarily multicultural, may lie in both the real and imagined experience of place, and what defines a place in both real, imagined, and philosophical senses, in what moves within oneself as memory. As one strategy, the native protagonist of Tommy Orange's fictional novel titled There, negotiates an urban native perspective by describing both city-dwelling natives and non-native objects existing in cities as living memories of the land and earth. In quotes, urban Indians were the generation born in the city, Orange writes. We've been moving for a long time, but the land moves with you like a memory. An urban Indian belongs to the city, and cities belong to the earth, end quote. The narrator rhetorically expresses how all we know of is organically derived from the earth, including the materials that make up cities. Everything here is formed in relation to every other living and non-living thing from the earth, Orange writes. The process that brings anything to its current form, chemical, synthetic, technological, or otherwise, doesn't make the product not a product of the living earth. Buildings, freeways, cars, are these not of the earth? Were they shipped in from Mars, the moon? Are we so different? Were we at one time not something else entirely? Homo sapiens, single-celled organisms, space dust, unidentifiable pre-Bang quantum theory? The narrator of Orange's novel describes urban indigenous perspective as taking on memory of terra firma, because at its origin, the material memory of cities is part of nature itself. The aforementioned quoted sentences involving we, through which the narrator deftly shifts the subject of discussion from object to human, refutes derisory names for urban indigenous persons in prior paragraphs, which is a defense of urban natives who feel inaccurately characterized as detribalized, in quote, citified apples, Orange writes. An apple is red on the outside, white on the inside, end quote. Urban Indians are just as organic, the narrator claims, and are derived from carbon-based space dust, like everything else. I first heard the verb indigenize from American anthropologist Marshall Solins. I'm not sure what it means exactly to indigenize something, but perhaps Orange is working with adjacent ideas here. Perhaps in an attempt to indigenize city living, Orange's narrator distills all objects to their origin, which neutralizes bureaucratic and policy-based fabrications between rural, native, and urban spaces. The question remains as to how indigeneity is not only defined in relation to claims to ancestral regions, but also beyond these claims, especially for natives who have adapted their traditional customs to urban life. The text Indigenous in the City discusses how often natives migrate between rural areas and cities and find ways to hybridize, integrate, and advance their cultures through personal expression and shared communal activities. Potlatches in cities existing outside ancestral territories are a testament to the ability of natives to find cultural traditions beyond geography and distinct biomes. Another example, like a personal one of mine, is I sometimes review our Athabascan language dictionary, for which my great-grandmother and relatives provided translations. I learn new meanings, histories, and worldviews contained within Dinaka, wherein a symbolic and language-based, not simply physical, appreciation of our culture creates a personal understanding of native ways of living. The land moves with you like a memory, Orange says, in how feelings from memories flare and bloom unexpectedly in our lives like blood through a blanket, end quote. I hold similar views as Orange does, in that the experience of being urbanized and also native is in part psychological because multiculturalism is a mode of being that can only exist within the person of those multiple heritages. However, in the process of transforming place from a geographic turf to a memory within oneself, to an idea, wherein a symbolic, not simply physical, appreciation of our culture creates personal definitions of being native, the strategy of indigenizing modernity, especially for myself, involves contradictory and heterogeneous experience within Indian territory, because such are those out of context memories that flare and bloom unexpectedly. In 1983, Native artists George Longfish and Joanne Randall wrote about contextual and place-based contradictions essential to Native experience in their text, Contemporary Native American Art, Contradictions in Indian Territory. Concluding this essay, the co-authors write, "Destiny has made you an Indian and perhaps has had something to do with your being an artist. Your children are Indians who learn the stories, the ceremonies, and a sense of profound difference with those in the dominant culture. They also learn to run computers, drive automobiles, watch Mazola corn oil commercials, and make a living in a modern Indian world. If you are able to make these considerations, perhaps you will find that the contradictions of Indian territory are authentically Indian. I have learned that ideas about multiculturalism and urban indigeneity are complex experiences that shift and meld depending on location and geography, calling for expansive definitions of indigeneity in relation to a particular landmass. As an example, when my family and I fish the Yukon River during the summertime, this activity is not easily translatable to Los Angeles because of the distinct Alaskan biome, such as grizzly and black bears, mosquitoes, the bright midnight sun, and equipment that are compatible with this particular environment. So this is a photo of me when I think I was like 10 or 11 years old, and we're on the Yukon River, and after we fished, we actually dumped the fish guts on the other side of the river. This is in the 90s, and we got into the boat, and we turned on the engine, and we took about 20 seconds for bears to come out of the forest, and just enjoy. Pretty soon the bears got smart, and they started to swim across the river. So we had to stop. But I just wanted to show this because there's a little black bear, and there's me looking all proud, like I have no idea how dangerous that was. So in the wilderness, there are no roads or power grids. Our refrigerator is a homemade cellar that stays cold during the summers because of the Alaskan terrain's permafrost. This way of life during the summer is incompatible, in my view, and incomparable to Los Angeles city life. Heterogeneity is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as incommensurable through being of different kinds, degrees, and dimensions. My particular biculturalism is that. I would call my cultural understanding somewhat fragmented, non-pejoratively, with attempts to stabilize these shifting perspectives with specific memories of cultural experiences that are recalled outside their context. Native activities such as trapping and fishing along the Yukon is based on thousands of years of our ancestors doing so in this region. For this reason, these experiences of home, from Yukon fishing to town and city living, feel like different versions of reality. Because of my own subjecthood, needs, desires, and unconscious feelings, multicultural experience must necessarily embrace memory as a primary component, wherein a psychological, not simply physical, appreciation of culture creates personal definitions of selfhood. I ask now how one might continue to express Native culture in a way that speaks to a contemporary Native experience that is more often than not self-aware of its own dislocation from cultural lands, and is also aware of the circular migratory patterns many Natives take to go back to their ancestral lands. Moreover, what art could exist that describes the range of combinations of contemporary Native activities that accurately describe the complexities of place for bicultural and multicultural experiences? What might this art look like? So I also just want to show one more photo. That's the midnight sun on the Yukon River. That's the view from our campsite. So I think that's around 11 p.m. this summer. As a fellow here in Santa Fe, I created a sculpture covered in beadwork, moose hide, animal parts, and bioplastic, and also has a digital component wherein small projectors create reflections of light that simulate the aurora. This sculpture is inspired by my background in the Alaskan wilderness, but also my background in the city. It incorporates coated plastic, construction foam, metal, and glass materials that speak to an urban context. Yet the piece is also made of birch wood, as birch is found in the boreal regions of the subarctic. Birch has healing properties. For thousands of years, Athabascans have used birch sap as an antiseptic, and the fungi growing on it, called chaga, staves off a variety of ailments. Its bark peel is also excellent for starting fires. As you'll see in the studio after this talk, this art piece is draped in a type of bioplastic I made of water-based plant material that references the Yukon River where my ancestors lived and where my family fishes today. Getting this fellowship at the Indian Arts Research Center has emboldened me to make work that didn't check all these perfect little boxes, as if I could only be a traditional Native artist or I could only make non-Native work, but really speak to an authentic place of who I am and how I see my world. This art piece will also contain projected imagery of a large clay storage jar from the Pueblo Acoma peoples created in the 1880s to 1900s that is part of the collection here at the Indian Arts Research Center. While highlighting the collection's influence on me, I am displaying a novel format for visualizing Native objects and those histories by projecting them within my sculpture as a hologram. Expressing multiculturalism requires epistemological and ontological leanings because, in my experience, it involves worlds colliding. When in the hands of artists, I believe atmospheric digital projections allow for the mapping of an interiority onto any location, so as to create a distinct sense of place and environment that is unique to a particular subjecthood. I believe digital video projection can allow anyone to literally project their own reality onto the world. In my work, I embrace both physical and digital media to negotiate liminal boundaries, creating a sense of space that is both there and not there, rather than the depiction of a geographic terrain or landscape that I may or may not be consistently subsisting on. My work encompasses a psychic vision of land, to quote Longfish and Randall, resulting from a voluntary, and this consistently subsisting on due to migratory dislocation realities for Native histories. Let's go to figure 8. Admittedly, my insistence that digital media with a physical component is conducive to multicultural perspectives is also based on loose theories and predilections. Perhaps it is the lack of a true and perfect simulation in digital artworks that creates the discrepancy between a real place and a fake place, between a real floating beadwork flower and a virtual floating beadwork flower, which points to a mysterious third space by evoking a spatial in-betweenness to be cognitively processed outside time. Moments of shaky pixelation and glitches endemic to the digital medium visually chop up space and time in their attempt to collide worlds. I seek out physical and digital resources to create a partial sense of native place, not a perfect simulacrum, arguably because a pastiche, makeshift, and provisional experience of indigeneity is more true to memory, while my art also attempts to, quote, work against the repressive force of fictive homogenization, end quote, which is a quote from a book review by Joanna Drucker that I will briefly explain. So my installation here shown was for my graduate thesis, and this is on which my Indian Arts Research Center piece is based. This piece diffracts and multiplies projected imagery of beadwork through mirrors and upcycled PPE plexiglass. You can see on the bottom there's like sort of glass and things. It's just a bunch of plastic that I just found around campus. The light moves through defunct and failed pandemic year, specific to a dark mirror time and place in history, where bits of plastic superficially separated cashiers from customers and reception desks from students on my school's campus in Northridge, California. Perhaps in defiance of what the light reflects through, the light from the projected image evokes other worlds, other sensibilities than those of this dark time, by emitting a large-scale diffracted image of craft, beadwork, hearkening to distinctly different means and modes for existence. This liminal sense of place, quote, having broken out of the binary opposition between circular and linear, gives a third space in a different time the chance to emerge, end quote. Digital artwork exists away from the keyboard and within the keyboard, is there and not there in a digital physical land. My work is what Sangari describes as a borderland, or perhaps what the theorist Edouard Glissant describes as a frontier zone when he writes on multiculturalism, particular to creolization. By asking the viewer and myself to fill in the rest of the experience by providing a simulation of natural light here in my studio at Indian Arts Research Center, I also specifically describe my feelings of dislocation that is my personal experience of multiculturalism, deliberately making strange the merging of two locations, while also acknowledging that merging as impossible. Like a transparent and shifting rendering of a projection, overlaid into a room, memory is choppy, nonlinear, circular, repetitive. It glitches as we are bound to one space while thinking about another. In my case, the heritage-based activities I perform on the Yukon, or even when I'm just hanging out in Fairbanks with family, which is the town my mother was raised in, and where she now resides, these experiences are more often a recall than an actual embodiment when I'm 2,000 miles away. Okay. Beyond this residency, I hope to make a larger installation that can take over a very large room and celebrate my Athabascan heritage. I would like to provide the important caveat that I make this work to celebrate these complexities, so I do not use the word dislocation or fragmentation pejoratively. I intend for this work to provide a seat of empowerment, rather, for myself and others. So here's another view. Perhaps the aurora itself, which is literally displaced light in the sky that often feels like it comes out of nowhere, can be some kind of metaphor for indigenous dislocation as also a seat of empowerment. By placing simulations of indigeneity and atmospheric light from an ancestral land in a room comprised of mixed materials that sometimes are part of that indigenous context and sometimes deliberately incongruous with that context, these mixed physical digital artworks speak to the non-ubiquity and heterogeneity of memory recall that makes up bicultural identity. Joanna Drucker states in her review of Lippard's text, Mixed Blessings, in 1990, atavistic yet resurgent nationalism and nostalgia for an ethnic purity of any kind all carry repressive force. The fact of current culture is that it contains the impossible mix of contradictory and unblended elements. Artwork that evidences these contradictions without posing simplistic terms for resolution helps to put such concepts into mainstream circulation where they work against the repressive force of fictive homogenization. I hope my work here refutes stereotypical depictions of natives confined to some romantic, ethnic, spiritual purity of a false past, or that we're now basically confined to reservations, which is all part of the colonial psyche. Moreover, depicting natives as expansively roaming, not on a single geographic plane, but multiple decentralized ones, signifies revised histories of not only the tribes of the lower 48 states that are far from confined to reservation life, but also signals the nuanced history of Alaskan natives in that reservations were not adopted across Alaska Native tribes. There's only one reservation in Alaska, and that's on like an island, and it's really small. With this in mind, native expression of land can be negotiated as not only a physical terrain, but also as an idea that does not need to be a direct daily experience. So in conclusion, the goal of this presentation is to provide nuanced multicultural definitions of indigeneity. This goal is not to replace these definitions with new ones that do not value ties to ancestral lands, where real claims to native subsistence rights are substantial and meaningful. It may not only be a matter of what defines native, but more of when and with what mental expression, objects, or activities one has on hand. The definition of land-based, conceived over 40 years ago, arguably begins the process of identity reparation required to overcome superficial dichotomies created through policy definitions of indigeneity, which were based on notions of homelands as discrete spaces with borders separating territories and census records determining the urbanization of a given space. In other words, by adding more nuance to the definition of indigeneity in relation to physical terrain, my work describes a felt experience of being native and does not ascribe yet another category for indigeneity from an external, generalized overview that is bureaucratic in origin. Through self-definition, I try to reach goals within Indigenous futures movements in how indigeneity continues to navigate and negotiate definitions of itself within the new normal that is today's technology-based reality, which is itself a decentralized and diffuse, virtually experienced realm. By merging digital projections of Alaska Native and urban culture with even another locale of that, which is the Southwest, with its own unique Native histories, I hope my artwork could be an example of how one might describe Native as also multi-localized and polyspatial. Additionally, beyond the scope of this presentation, projection-based light artworks reinscribe the supposed objectivity of light-based works, such as the famous predominantly white male Southern California light and space movement, with an influx of subjective and shifting indigenous female identifying meaning. Light in this sense can never be objective, and so my work intends to be a critique of the light and space movement as well, not an addendum to it. I hope this presentation provides an authentic experience of multicultural reality that has a complex relationship to place. In using physical digital techniques, one might provide nuance for definitions of native, not by reducing an understanding of it to discrete objects and places existing within separate contexts, but by going beyond in elaborating on definitions of indigeneity in relation to decentralized technology-based realms. Thank you.
Thank you, Janna. So this portion of the evening, we're going to open up for a Q&A. I have a few questions to kick things off, but feel free to raise your hands at any point if you want to jump in. So my first question has to do with your place-based objects. Can you elaborate on your thinking behind some of your choice in materials, like your found objects or place-based objects, and how that may have evolved being here in Santa Fe?
Yeah, definitely. So there's, I'm holding some sage, and so it felt important to me to work with materials that are just naturally around me. I think there's such a tendency on artists, because it's easier and more affordable just to buy plastic-based paints and synthetic materials, but I'm trying to work in a practical sense, but also a symbolic space where the work uses bioplastic, where it uses natural-based materials. Like there's also some rocks holding together a little sheet. It's kind of hard to see, but there are some. The New Mexico rocks here are just like fire. They're gorgeous. I've never seen anything like that in my life. The only rocks they remind me of remotely is the Yukon River rocks, which are also multicolored and amazing. But yeah, it's just also kind of evoking my sort of childhood of sifting through rocks in the Yukon, so trying to take that perspective, to where I am. So.
Can you, you mentioned bioplastic, can you let folks know what is bioplastic?
Yeah, it's basically like plant jello. Okay. It's glycerin and it's algae, and it's like cooking. You mix some water, and you let it dry, and it's very relaxing, and it creates these nice thin sheets. Is that
what you use to reflect the light through?
So that's going to be a component in the studio, yes. So there's going to be some usage of that, and also I like how the bioplastic starts to imitate the skin of moose hide. So having just that, complexity of material interaction, just kind of taking it a little bit one step further, not just moose hide, but some transparent nebulous skin. I think that makes art interesting, and sometimes even a little confusing, and I think that's okay.
Thanks. So again, speaking with materials, some of your digital renderings feature beadwork, and can you speak to that beadwork? Is that something you produce yourself, or how do you acquire it?
So the beadwork here, most of this beadwork. So this beadwork, I do my own beadwork. This object right here is a little beadwork that I was raised with. So I guess it's part of my mother's collection, which is, I think, like a highbrow term for just like stuff we had around the house. And so it's something that I just grew up with like my whole life. And so that's why I wanted to incorporate it.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions from the audience right now? I have one. Oh, right here?
I have one.
Okay.
There.
And before you answer, I'll go ahead and repeat it for virtual folks. So I'll be the in-between.
How did you get so focused on that book?
So the question was, how did she get so focused on this book?
I read it.
Yeah. It's a very, I think the ending's quite sad. For me it was. And I read it when I was, grieving over my grandmother passing away. So it felt like the right book at the right time for me. I really, really took to the intro where, it talks about building sky rises in relation to computer chip technology, in relation to space dust, in relation to indigeneity. So I think it just spoke to my sort of really pluralistic interests. I'm curious why you asked that question too.
It's a very unsettling book. It's not a happy story.
Right. Yeah.
Struggle of Native Americans in urban Los Angeles.
It's in Oakland, but
Oakland,
yeah.
excuse me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's unsettling. I think reality can be unsettling, and every reality is imperfect and complicated, and so in that way it's okay, I think, to think about those things.
No, it was just
Yeah.
interesting that this specific
Mhm.
piece spoke to you so much.
Yeah. Well, the pandemic was really hard on everybody. I think it spoke to me also because of that context too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So my question has to do with the location in which you are working on a piece. So at one point you spoke about being based in Los Angeles and you're creating works that speak to the dislocation and almost like this yearning you feel for your native Alaska. Have you worked on any of these pieces while you're at home? Was your time spent elsewhere? And what kind of conceptual implications do you think there are for when you're in Alaska, kind of creating Alaska, if that makes sense?
Oh, I don't know if I understand.
That's a big question.
It's got multiple parts to it. It's a really good question.
Let's start with,
Yeah.
have you worked on any digital renderings or any of what we've
yeah.
seen? Have you recreated that while you're back home?
In Alaska? Yeah, definitely. I've done some video footage. Most of my footage was in late February, early March. Actually, I can scroll to it. This was taken really above my grandparents' house in Fairbanks. So I took that, and that really helped me figure out a lot of things and what I was doing and why I was doing it. It was just reminding myself of the Northern Lights, and there really isn't anything like it except going to just see it, I feel. I think there's a tenderness and a futility in me attempting to recreate that, and I think that's also part of the work, if that helps.
Yeah, so it sounds like you go to Alaska and you find your inspiration and you collect images or whatever, whatever source material, and when you leave is when you start to get into.
I see what you're saying is more about my process.
Yeah.
I mean, I go to Alaska just as myself. I'm not really expecting to find anything artistically viable. I just go and experience what I'm there to experience, which is just my family and, my heritage, for lack of a better word, going to the Yukon, just hanging out with cousins. It's not as formal as maybe this, this sort of portrays.
Yeah, I wouldn't think
Yeah.
so. I think it's maybe more so my reflection on your process and that migration of your creative process, whether you're cognizant of it or not.
Yeah, totally.
Anyhow, any other questions from the audience? Yeah, one more.
Is there a belief system associated with the Northern Lights with your tribal ancestry?
So the question was if there is a belief system associated with basically your tribal connections or heritage.
To the Northern Lights.
To the Northern Lights, did I say that?
Yeah. There are, there's this, so when we saw this over my grandparents' house, it was me, my mom, and my aunt bought me these earrings, and we all just came out and we decided to whistle, because if you whistle, that makes it come out more and makes it dance. So that's just like one sort of, I guess, thing that we've just always done my whole life. But yeah, I mean, it came out at the most miraculous time. I mean, there is a history of spirituality in relation to the biome. It's also a history of awe and respect, and it's something that I think it kind of goes outside of the context of spirituality that you see in other religions. I think it's more, I don't know, my perspective of Indigenous spirituality is it's really baked into objects in everyday life in a way that doesn't feel separate from it. So this is just one aspect of like the sort of collective experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. Anyone else? One more? Yep.
You showed the rendering of your proposed work.
Yes.
That's something you have planned, a location, a time?
Yeah, none of the above. It's just future goals, honestly. I think the interesting thing about optics art that I learned is once you get the angles right, all you have to do is scale it up. And scaling it up just involves funding.
So we need money. Anyone out
It's
there
okay.
who wants to donate? All right. I think with that being said, we'll conclude the Q&A portion of the evening. Janna and I are going to sneak out, and we're going to meet you over at the Dubin Studio. I have SAR staff in the back who can raise their hands if you want to look back. These are the people you follow. They're safe, no stranger danger. And we'll meet you over at the studio for light refreshments and to see Janna's artwork. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
thanks everyone virtually who logged in.